The supermarket doors slid open with a mechanical whoosh, letting in a gust of the cold London air. Big Shaq stepped inside, shaking the dampness from his hoodie. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow over the neatly stacked aisles, and the air carried a mix of freshly baked bread and industrial-strength floor cleaner. It was the kind of place where people came to grab their essentials and leave. No time for small talk, no room for kindness. Shaq's broad shoulders made him stand out among the hurried shoppers. At 6'4", built like a heavyweight boxer, he was used to people giving him wary glances. He had seen it all before, the subtle clutching of purses, the nervous shifting away in crowded spaces, the quick double-take from security guards. But he had learned long ago to ignore it. Tonight, he wasn't here to make a scene. He was here for one thing: his mother's medicine. His boots squeaked against the tile floor as he navigated toward the pharmacy aisle. His mother, who had raised him alone, had been battling arthritis for years. The pain had worsened lately, and she needed her prescription refilled. Shaq had spent the entire day working on a construction site in the freezing wind, his muscles aching, but none of that mattered. He wasn't the type to complain. As he reached for the small white box of pain relievers, he felt a tug on his hoodie. "Excuse me, mister?" a small voice piped up. He looked down to see a boy no older than 7, clutching a chocolate bar in his tiny hands. The child had bright eyes, filled with curiosity, and a hesitant smile. "Yeah, little man?" Shaq crouched slightly to meet him at eye level. "Are you in the NBA?" the boy asked, his voice hushed as if he were uncovering a great secret. Shaq let out a deep chuckle. "Nah, kid. Just a regular guy." The boy's face fell slightly. "Oh, you look like a basketball player." Shaq grinned. "Appreciated, though. Maybe in another life." Before the boy could say more, a woman, his mother, most likely, rushed over, her expression tight with worry. She grabbed the child's hand and pulled him away, flashing Shaq an apologetic glance. "Sorry about that," she muttered before ushering the boy toward the checkout. Shaq sighed. He had done nothing wrong, yet the woman's reaction was familiar. It was always the same: people judged before they understood. He turned back to his task, grabbed the medicine, and made his way to the self-checkout section. The line was slow-moving, packed with last-minute shoppers. An elderly woman fumbled with her change, while a teenager in front of Shaq scrolled mindlessly on his phone, oblivious to the world around him. Shaq tapped his fingers against the medicine box, his patience thinning. His mother was waiting. "Next!" a voice barked. Shaq looked up to see a cashier at the manned counter waving him over. The man, Mike, looked to be in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a tired expression that suggested he had been working this job for far too long. "Come on, mate, don't got all night," Mike grumbled. Shaq exhaled, stepping forward. He placed the medicine box and a bottle of water on the counter, reaching for his wallet. Mike barely glanced at the items before scanning them. His eyes flickered up, studying Shaq's face for a moment longer than necessary. "That all?" Mike asked, his tone sharp. Shaq nodded. "Yeah." Mike's eyes narrowed slightly. He reached under the counter, pressing a button, one that Shaq recognized immediately. It was the silent call for security. Shaq stiffened. "Something wrong?" Mike's lips curled into a forced smile. "Just a routine check." Shaq followed his gaze and saw a security guard, a burly man in a blue uniform, heading toward them. His stomach clenched. He had been in this situation before, and he already knew where it was going. "Sir, I need you to empty your pockets," Mike said, loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. A few heads turned. A woman in line shifted uncomfortably. A man in a business suit raised an eyebrow. Shaq's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Mike's voice was firm now, his fingers drumming against the counter. "I saw you pocket something near the aisles. Just hand it over, and we won't make this a big deal." Shaq felt heat rising in his chest. His hands balled into fists at his sides. He had been accused before, assumed guilty before proving innocence. And every time, it felt like a fresh wound. I didn't take anything, Shaq said, keeping his voice steady. Mike scoffed. Right. And I'm the King of England. A murmur spread through the small crowd. The security guard stepped closer. Sir, if you cooperate, we can resolve this quickly. Shaq glanced around. People were staring. Judging. The boy from earlier was watching from a few feet away, his chocolate bar half unwrapped, eyes wide with confusion. Shaq took a slow breath. He had two choices, fight or prove himself, again. His heart pounded as he slowly reached into his pockets, turning them inside out for everyone to see. Empty. Mike's smirk faltered. The security guard hesitated. Check the cameras, Shaq said, his voice measured but firm. If you're so sure, prove it. Mike swallowed. He hadn't expected Shaq to challenge him so directly. The store fell into an awkward silence, the weight of judgment hanging heavy in the air. Shaq held his ground, his pulse hammering. He knew the truth, but would anyone else believe it? The silence in the store was suffocating. Big Shaq stood tall, his broad frame unshaken, but inside, a storm brewed. The weight of every past accusation, every side-eye glance, every moment of unfair judgment pressed down on him. Mike, the cashier, shifted on his feet. His earlier confidence had flickered, but his ego wouldn't let him back down so easily. He folded his arms and nodded toward the security guard. Go on then, he muttered. Check him. The security guard, a thick-set man with a trimmed beard, hesitated. His name tag read Daniel, and unlike Mike, he wasn't looking at Shaq with immediate hostility, just caution. Sir, do you mind if I search you? Daniel asked, his voice more neutral than accusatory. Shaq clenched his jaw. He had nothing to hide, but the principle of it gnawed at him. Every time he had been treated like a suspect, every time someone assumed he was up to no good just because of how he looked, it wasn't just an accusation. It was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how kind he was, some people would always see him as a threat first and a man second. I do mind, Shaq said evenly. You don't get to search me just because he thinks I stole something. The murmur among the onlookers grew. A woman near the fruit aisle whispered something to her husband. The teenage cashier at the next register stole glances at the commotion, pretending to scan items while eavesdropping. Mike scoffed. Mate, if you got nothing to hide, why not just cooperate? Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose. Because I shouldn't have to prove I'm innocent. You should have proof before you accuse me. Daniel scratched the back of his head, glancing at Mike. Did you actually see him take something? Mike's eyes darted to the counter. I saw him near the shelves, acting suspicious. Shaq let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. So now shopping is suspicious? Mike's ears turned red. Look, I know how this goes. I've worked here long enough to know when someone's up to something. Shaq's fists tightened. He wasn't just fighting for himself now. He was fighting for every person who had ever been wrongly accused, for every time someone had been made to feel small just because they didn't fit someone else's idea of who belonged where. Call the manager, Shaq said. His voice was steady, but the steel behind it was undeniable. Mike hesitated. That won't be necessary. Yeah, it will, Shaq interrupted. Because if you're going to embarrass me like this, we're going to do it right. We're checking the cameras. Daniel sighed, nodding. I think that's fair. I'll get Mr. Patel. He turned and strode toward the back office. The tension in the store thickened. Mike tapped his fingers against the counter, his face betraying the first flickers of doubt. But Shaq had seen men like him before, people who never admitted they were wrong until they were forced to. The little boy from earlier stood beside his mother a few feet away, his small fingers curled around the half-eaten chocolate bar. His big eyes flickered between Shaq and Mike. Shaq's chest tightened. Asterisk, what's he seeing right now? What's he learning? Asterisk. A few minutes passed before a short, middle-aged man in a crisp button-up shirt emerged from the back office. His name tag read Mr. Patel, store manager. What's going on here? Mr. Patel asked, his voice sharp, his gaze flicking between Shaq, Mike, and Daniel. Mike spoke up first. I believe he stole something. He was acting suspicious near the shelves. Mr. Patel's expression darkened. Did you see him take anything? Mike faltered. I saw him move something into his pocket. Shaq exhaled sharply. Check the cameras. Mr. Patel sighed. Fine. Daniel, take him to the back and review the footage. Daniel nodded, gesturing for Shaq to follow. Shaq hesitated. He didn't like the idea of going into some back room where he had no control over the situation. He looked at Mr. Patel. I want it checked out here. In front of everyone. Mr. Patel studied him, then nodded. He turned toward the service counter, where a small monitor was mounted on the wall. With a few clicks, he accessed the store's security feed. The entire store seemed to hold its breath as the footage played. The screen showed Shaq walking into the pharmacy aisle, browsing, picking up a box of medicine, and then heading toward the checkout. No theft. No suspicious movements. Just a man trying to buy something for his mother. Mike's face strained of color. Shaq crossed his arms. So? A thick, uncomfortable silence filled the air. Mr. Patel exhaled, rubbing his temples. Mike, you got this wrong. Mike's jaw tensed. His gaze darted around as if looking for a way out of the situation. I was just doing my job, he muttered. Shaq took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. No, you weren't. You were judging. Mike's lip twitched. He looked like he wanted to argue, but for the first time, he had no words. Shaq turned his attention to Mr. Patel. This happens too often. I don't need an apology. I just need people like him to think before they assume. Mr. Patel nodded, his face grim. You're right. This shouldn't have happened. A flicker of movement caught Shaq's eye. The little boy was still watching him, wide-eyed, clutching his chocolate bar. Shaq met his gaze and forced a small, reassuring smile. The boy's mother tugged at his sleeve, ready to leave, but the boy hesitated. Then, in a small voice, he said, Mom, he didn't do anything wrong. Shaq's heart clenched. His gaze shifted back to Mike, who was now looking anywhere but at him. The damage was done. But there was still one more choice to make. Did Shaq let this anger eat at him? Or did he rise above it? His next words would define the moment. Shaq stood there, his heartbeat steady, but the weight of the moment pressed against his chest like a heavy brick. The truth was out. The security footage had cleared him. But the damage had already been done. People had stared. Judged. Whispered. And now that they knew he wasn't guilty? Silence. No one apologized. No one spoke up. The same people who had looked at him like a criminal just minutes ago now avoided his gaze, pretending nothing had happened. Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing himself to unclench his fists. This wasn't new. He had spent years swallowing moments like this, pretending they didn't bother him. But they did. Every time they did. Mike, the cashier, still stood behind the counter, avoiding Shaq's eyes. His face was stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line, but his guilt was written all over him. Shaq could have let it go. Could have walked out, taken his mother's medicine, and left this all behind. But something held him there. The little boy. He was still watching, his fingers tight around his mother's coat sleeve. His small brows were furrowed, confusion clear in his young eyes. He had witnessed everything. The accusation. The humiliation. The proof of innocence. And now he was waiting. Waiting to see what Shaq would do next. Shaq swallowed, pushing down the anger that threatened to rise. He wasn't just reacting for himself anymore. He was setting an example. He turned to Mike, his deep voice steady. You accused me without proof. Mike flinched slightly. Shaq continued, his tone controlled but firm. You called me out in front of everyone. Made me feel small. Made me have to prove myself, when I shouldn't have had to. Mike finally looked up, his face tight with discomfort. I thought. You thought. Shaq interrupted. Yeah, You thought wrong. Mike's mouth opened, then closed. He had no defense left. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. I don't care about an apology. I've been through this too many times to expect one. Mike swallowed. His fingers twitched against the counter. Look, mate, Shaq held up a hand. I'm not finished. Mike shut his mouth. Shaq took a breath, steadying himself. You saw a big black guy and assumed the worst. You didn't stop to think about what that says about you. His voice softened, just slightly. You ever been accused of something you didn't do, Mike? Mike blinked, caught off guard. Shaq tilted his head. You ever had people look at you like a criminal when you were just minding your business? Mike hesitated. His throat bobbed. No, he admitted quietly. Shaq nodded. Then maybe next time, you think twice before doing it to someone else. Silence stretched between them. Mike glanced away, his fingers tapping nervously on the counter. He wasn't used to being called out like this, not in a way that didn't involve shouting or anger. Just the truth laid bare. Shaq didn't wait for a response. He turned to Mr. Patel. I came here to buy medicine for my mother. That's all. Mr. Patel nodded, his face still tight with regret. I understand. You don't have to pay for it. It's on the house. Shaq's jaw tightened. I don't need charity. I need respect. Mr. Patel hesitated, then slowly nodded. You're right. And I'll be having a conversation with my staff about this. Shaq exhaled. It wasn't much. But it was something. He reached into his wallet, pulled out the exact amount, and placed it on the counter. Then, without another word, he grabbed the bag with the medicine and turned to leave. As he walked past the little boy, he paused. The child's eyes were wide, filled with something that looked like admiration. Shaq crouched slightly, just like he had earlier when the boy had asked if he was in the NBA. Always stand up for what's right, little man, he said quietly. The boy nodded quickly, gripping his chocolate bar. I will. A small smile tugged at Shaq's lips. Then, with a deep breath, he straightened and headed toward the exit. The store doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the cold London air hit him. But this time, it didn't feel as harsh. As he stepped outside, the tension in his chest loosened just a little. He had been tested. Again. And once again, he had chosen dignity over rage. But something told him this moment wasn't over yet. Because sometimes, the people who judge you the hardest are the ones who need to change the most. The cold London air bit at Shaq's face as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. The plastic bag carrying his mother's medicine rustled in his grip, but his mind was still back in that store, back in the moment when he had once again been forced to prove his innocence. He had handled it the best way he could. He had controlled his temper, spoken his truth, walked away with his dignity intact. But why did it still feel so heavy? Shaq pulled his hood up and started walking toward the bus stop. His mother's small apartment wasn't far, but after a long day of construction work and this exhausting encounter, he didn't have the energy to make the trek on foot. Just as he reached the shelter, a voice called out from behind him. Wait up. Shaq turned, his body tensing instinctively. It was Mike. The cashier jogged toward him, his breath coming out in short puffs of cold air. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and for the first time, he didn't have that smug, defensive look on his face. Instead, he just looked tired. Maybe even ashamed. Shaq raised an eyebrow. What do you want? Mike stopped a few feet away, hesitating. Look, man. I messed up. Shaq crossed his arms. He wasn't about to make this easy. Mike rubbed the back of his neck. I shouldn't have assumed. I shouldn't have called security. I get it now. I was wrong. Shaq studied him for a moment. He had heard apologies before, some forced, some empty, some just meant to move things along. But there was something different in Mike's tone. It wasn't just about making himself feel better. You ever ask yourself why you did it? Shaq asked. Mike exhaled, kicking a stray pebble on the pavement. I don't know, man. Habit, I guess. The way I grew up. I've seen blokes steal from the shop before. And yeah, some of them looked like you. I guess I let that shape the way I see things. Shaq nodded slowly. That's the problem, isn't it? Mike sighed. Yeah. He looked up, meeting Shaq's eyes. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the reason some kid grows up thinking the world's out to get him just 'cause of how he looks. Shaq thought of the little boy inside the store. How he had watched everything unfold with those wide, questioning eyes. He shifted the bag in his hand. You can't take back what happened, Shaq said. But you can decide what kind of man you want to be moving forward. Mike nodded, his face serious. I will. Shaq studied him for a beat longer, then sighed. All right. Mike blinked. All right? I accept your apology, Shaq said. But words don't mean much unless your actions back them up. Mike gave a small, almost sheepish smile. Fair enough. A bus rumbled up to the curb, its brakes hissing as the doors swung open. Shaq took a step forward, then paused. Next time, Mike, just think before you assume. Mike gave a small nod. I will. With that, Shaq stepped onto the bus and found a seat near the back. As the vehicle pulled away, he glanced out the window. Mike was still standing there, hands in his pockets, watching the bus disappear down the street. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a change. But for Shaq, this was just another day in a world that still had a long way to go. And something told him this wasn't the last time he'd have to fight to be seen for who he really was. The bus ride was quiet, but Shaq's mind was anything but. He leaned his head against the cold window, the city lights blurring past like scattered stars. Mike's apology replayed in his mind. It had been real, Shaq could tell, but would it actually change anything? People always said they'd do better, but too often they fell back into old habits. Still, something about this felt different. As the bus slowed near his stop, Shaq pushed himself up, gripping the bag tightly. His mother's small apartment was just a few blocks away, a familiar walk he had made countless times. The streets were quiet at this hour, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog. As he rounded the corner onto his mother's street, he spotted her window, third one from the left, lights still on. He smiled to himself. She never sleeps early. He climbed the steps and knocked lightly on the door. It didn't take long before the familiar sound of locks clicking open filled the hallway. The door swung open, revealing Mama Amina, her face instantly lighting up at the sight of him. Shaq! My boy! She beamed, pulling him into a warm hug. Despite her small frame, her embrace was firm, grounding him like it always did. Shaq chuckled, hugging her back. You know I had to check on you, Ma? She pulled away, her dark eyes scanning his face with a mother's instinct. You look tired. Come in, sit. Shaq stepped inside, letting the warmth of the tiny apartment wrap around him. The familiar scent of cardamom tea and home-cooked food filled the air, instantly soothing him. She closed the door behind him and gestured toward the couch. I was just making tea. You want some? Shaq nodded. Yeah, Ma. That'd be nice. As she bustled toward the kitchen, Shaq took a deep breath, finally letting himself relax. But the moment of peace didn't last long. Because as soon as he set the bag with her medicine down on the coffee table, his phone buzzed. He frowned, pulling it out. It was a message from an unknown number. Mike ***, hey mate. I know it's late, but something's happening at the store. I think you should know. ***. Shaq's brows furrowed. Before he could even respond, another message came through. ***, there's a guy here, real aggressive. Says he saw what happened earlier. He's calling me out in front of everyone, saying I got off too easy. ***. Shaq's stomach tightened. Mike had been wrong earlier, but he had apologized, he had tried to make it right. But now, someone else had taken it upon themselves to stir the pot. Shaq exhaled, his jaw tightening. He wasn't in the mood for more drama. Not tonight. But something told him this wasn't just about Mike anymore. This was about what kind of example Shaq wanted to set. He stood up, slipping his phone into his pocket. His mother emerged from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea, a knowing look in her eyes. "What is it, son?" Shaq hesitated. "It's nothing, Ma. Just something I need to handle." She set the cups down and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Shaq." He met her gaze. It was filled with warmth, understanding, but also concern. "You can't fix everything," she said softly. He sighed. "I know. But I can try." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then go. But be careful." Shaq leaned down, kissing her forehead. "Always." And with that, he turned and stepped back out into the night, heading toward the store. Shaq moved quickly through the quiet London streets, his long strides fueled by something heavier than urgency. This wasn't just about Mike anymore. This was about the cycle, the same one he had seen too many times. One person does wrong, gets called out, tries to make amends, but then someone else, someone angrier, steps in and demands punishment instead of change. Shaq had spent his whole life navigating that fine line. And tonight was no different. As he turned the final corner, the store came into view. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow onto the pavement, and even from a distance, Shaq could see a small crowd gathered outside. Tension settled in his chest. He took a deep breath and walked forward. The moment he stepped inside, the hostility in the air was thick. Mike stood behind the counter, looking cornered, his face pale and unsure. Across from him stood a man Shaq recognized immediately, Tyrone. They had grown up in the same neighborhood. Same struggles. Same fights. But where Shaq had chosen to channel his anger into growth, Tyrone had embraced his. And right now, he was seething. "So this is the guy?" Tyrone's voice was sharp, slicing through the quiet. "This is the cashier who thought he could call my man a thief and just walk away." Mike swallowed hard, his hands gripping the counter. Tyrone cut him off, stepping closer. "You embarrassed him. You made him prove himself like he wasn't worth respect. You think that's okay?" Mike had no answer. His face was drained of color. Shaq stepped forward. "That's enough, Ty." Tyrone turned, his eyes narrowing. "Shaq," he said, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. "Didn't think you'd come back." Shaq kept his voice steady. "Yeah, well, you know me." Tyrone let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, I do. Always trying to be the bigger man." His smirk faded. "But not tonight. Not after what this guy did to you." Shaq exhaled. "He messed up. And he owned up to it." Tyrone's expression darkened. "That's not enough." Shaq took another step closer, his tone unwavering. "What do you want, Ty?" "Huh? You want him to suffer? You think making him scared is gonna fix anything?" Tyrone's fists clenched. "He didn't hesitate when he accused you. Why should I hesitate now?" Shaq shook his head. "Because if we fight hate with hate, nothing ever changes." Tyrone scoffed. "And what? We just forgive? Let them walk all over us." "No," Shaq said firmly. "But we teach them. We show them. We make them see us for who we really are, not what they assume we are." Tyrone let out a bitter laugh. "You think that works?" Shaq's voice was quiet but strong. "I think it's the only thing that ever has." Silence filled the store. Mike stood frozen behind the counter, watching them. The crowd outside peered in, waiting. Tyrone's jaw tightened. He looked between Shaq and Mike, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For a second, Shaq thought he might not back down. But then, with a sharp exhale, Tyrone stepped away. He shook his head, giving Shaq one last look. "You're too good for this world, man." Shaq met his gaze. "Maybe. But I'm trying to make it better." Tyrone studied him for a beat longer before turning toward the door. The crowd outside parted as he walked past, and just like that, the storm had passed. Shaq let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Mike, still pale, finally found his voice. I don't know what to say. Shaq turned to him. Then don't say anything. Just do better. Mike swallowed and nodded. Shaq looked around. The crowd outside was slowly dispersing, people murmuring among themselves. He had defused the situation. But he knew this wasn't the last time he'd faced something like this. It never was. Still, as he turned to leave, something in his chest felt lighter. Because tonight, he had proven something, not just to Mike, not just to Tyrone, but to himself. He wasn't just fighting for respect. He was fighting for change. And that fight was far from over.